Chapter 8: African Civilizations and the Spread of Islam. In 1324, a great caravan of more than 100 camels, many slaves, and a multitude of retainers crossed the arid Sahara Desert and wended its way into Cairo on the banks of the Nile. Mansa Musa, lord of the African Empire of Mali, was making the Hajj, H-A-J-J, the pilgrimage to Mecca, distributing gold with an open hand. The wealth and prodigality of the young king dazzled all who witnessed it. His polished manners and command of Arabic impressed those who met him, and his fame spread throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The chronicler Al-Omari, who visited Cairo a dozen years later, reported that people still spoke of the entourage of the young king that had spent so much gold in the markets and had given so much as gifts and alms that the price of gold actually declined due to its ample supply. Other great caravans had made the trek from Mali across the desert before, and some came after, but none had been so magnificent. Mansa Musa's caravan symbolized the wealthy potential of Africa, but even by the time he made his trip, West African gold was already well known in the world economy, and Africa was already involved in contacts of various kinds with other areas of the world. Mali, the kingdom of this great lord, fascinated the Muslim observers in Cairo, Damascus, and Fez. Like the earlier kingdom of Ghani, Mali was another state of the savannah country between the desert and the forests of West Africa, formed by the Malinke peoples. Its access to gold and control of the caravan routes had promoted its rise, and its powerful army had created an empire that extended over much of the savannah from the Niger to the Senegal River. Its ruling families had converted to Islam, but the famous and cosmopolitan Moroccan traveler Abdallah ibn Battuta, who visited Mali not long after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, found the local customs and food less refined than those of the elegant courts to which he was accustomed, and some of the practices shocking. Yet much was recognizable to him as well. Mali was an African kingdom that had become an extension of the Islamic world, and its success was tied to the trade routes that linked it to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The history of Mali underlines the fact that Africa below the Sahara was never totally isolated from the centers of civilization in Egypt, West Africa, or the Mediterranean, but for long periods the contacts were difficult and intermittent. This chapter will examine the increasing impact of a growing international network on Africa roughly in the period between 800 and 1600 CE. Chief among those influences was the arrival of Islam, which transformed many aspects of life in some African societies and brought them through trade, politics, and cultural exchange into increasing contact. But we must also recognize the African societies influenced by Islam often maintain their own traditions, that other African societies remain little touched by Islam and continue to develop along their own trajectories. African societies, diversity, and similarities. Like most continents, Africa is so vast and its societies so diverse that it is almost impossible to generalize about them. Differences in geography, language, religion, politics, and other aspects of life contributed to Africa's lack of political unity over long periods of time. Unlike in many parts of Asia, Europe, and North Africa, neither universal states nor universal religions characterized by the history of sub-Saharan Africa. Yet universal religions, first Christianity and later Islam, did find adherents in Africa and sometimes contributed to the formation of large states and empires. Societies with and without states. Some African societies had rulers who exercised control through a hierarchy of officials in what can be called states, but others were stateless societies organized around kingship or other forms of obligation and lacking the concentration of political power and authority we normally associate with the state. Sometimes the stateless societies were larger and more extensive than the neighboring states. Stateless societies had forms of government, but the authority and power normally exercised by a ruler and his court in a kingdom could be held instead by a council of families or by the community, with no need to tax the population to support the ruler, the bureaucrats, the army, or the nobles, as was usually the case in state-building societies. Stateless societies had little concentration of authority, and that authority affected only a small part of the people's lives. In these societies, government was rarely a full-time occupation. Other alternatives to formal government were possible. Among peoples of the West African forest, secret societies of men and women controlled customs and beliefs and were able to limit the authority of rulers. Especially among peoples who had the sharp rivalries between lineages or family groupings, secret societies developed that cut across the lineage divisions. Members' allegiance to these groups transcended their lineage ties. The secret societies settled village disputes. They acted to maintain stability within the community, and they served as an alternative to the authority of the state institutions. Throughout Africa, many stateless societies thrived, perhaps aided by the fact that internal social pressure or disputes often could be resolved by allowing dissidents to leave and establish a new village in the sparsely populated continent. Still, stateless societies found it difficult to resist external pressures, mobilize for warfare, organize large building projects, or create stable conditions for continuous long-distance trade with other peoples. All these needs or goals contributed to the formation of states in sub-Saharan Africa. State building took place under a variety of conditions. For example, West Africa experienced both the cultural influence of Islam and its own internal developments. The formation of some powerful states, such as Mali and Songhai, depended more on military power and dynastic alliances than on ethnic or cultural unity. In this development, and in the process of state formation itself, Africa paralleled the roughly contemporaneous developments of Western Europe. The growth of city-states with strong merchant communities in West Africa and on the Indian Ocean coast bore parties between the technologies and ideologies of Europeans and Africans also created differences in the ways these societies developed. That was made clear with the arrival of Europeans. The Portuguese in the 15th century, whose contact drew Africans increasingly into the world economy in ways that transformed African development in the following centuries. Common elements in African societies. Even amid the diversity of African cultures, certain similarities in language, thought, and religion provided some underlying unities. The spread of the Bantu-speaking peoples provided a linguistic base across much of Africa, so that even though specific languages differed, structure and vocabulary allowed some mutual understanding between neighboring Bantu speakers. The same might be said by the animistic religion that characterized much of Africa. From its earliest beginnings, it was belief that a soul or spirit existed in every object, even if it was animate. In a future state, this soul or spirit would exist as part of an immaterial soul. The spirit, therefore, was thought to be universal. Africans, like Europeans, believed that some evil, disasters, and illnesses were produced by witchcraft. Specialists were needed to combat the power of evil and eliminate the witches. This led to many societies to the existence of a class of diviners or priests who guided religious practice and helped protect the community. Above all, African religion provided a cosmology, a view of how the universe worked, and a guide to ethics and behavior. Many African peoples shared an underlying belief in a creator deity whose power and action were expressed through spirits or lesser gods and through the founding ancestors of the group. The ancestors often were viewed as the first settlers and thus the owners of the land or the local resources. Through them, the fertility of the land, game, people, and herds could be ensured. Among some groups, working the land on religious significance, so the land itself had a meaning beyond its economic usefulness. Religion, economics, and history were thus closely intertwined. The family, lineage, or clan around which many African societies were organized also had an important role in dealing with the gods. Deceased ancestors often were a direct link between their living relatives and the spiritual world. Veneration of the ancestors and gods was part of the same system of belief. Such a system was strongly linked to specific places and people. It showed remarkable resilience even in the face of contact with monotheistic religions such as Islam and Christianity. The economies of Africa are harder to describe in general terms than some basic aspects of politics and culture. North Africa, fully involved in the Mediterranean and Arab economic world, settled agriculture and skilled ironwork had been established before or advanced rapidly during the post-classical period. Specialization encouraged active local and regional trade, the basis for many lively markets and many large cities that grew in both the structured states and decentralized areas. The bustle and gaiety of market life were important ingredients of African society, and women as well as men participated actively. Professional merchants, in some cases in hereditary kinship groupings, often controlled trade. Participation in international trade increased in many regions in this period, mainly with the Islamic world and often through Arab traders. Finally, one of the least known aspects of early African societies is the size and dynamics of their populations. This is not only true of Africa, but much of the world. Archaeological evidence, travelers' reports, and educated guesses are used to estimate the population of early African societies. But in truth, our knowledge of how Africa fits into the general trends of the world population is very slight. By 1500, Africa may have had 30 to 60 million inhabitants. The arrival of Islam in North Africa. Africa north of the Sahara had long been part of the world of classical inequity, where Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, and Vandals traded, settled, built, battled, and destroyed. The Greek city of Cyrene, 600 BCE, in modern Libya, and the great Phoenician outpost of Carthage, founded 814 BCE, and Tunisia, attest to the part North Africa played in the classical world. After the age of the pharaohs, Egypt, conquered by Alexander in 331 BCE, had become an important part of the Greek world, and then later a key province in the Roman Empire, valued especially for its grain. Toward the end of the Roman Empire, Christianity had taken a firm hold in Mediterranean Africa, but in the warring between the Vandals and the Byzantines in North Africa in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, great disruptions had taken place. During this period, the Berber peoples of the Sahara had raided the coastal cities. As we have seen with Egypt, North Africa was linked across the Sahara to the rest of Africa in many ways. With the rise of Islam, those ties became even closer. Between 640 and 700 CE, the followers of Muhammad swept across North Africa from Suez to Morocco's Atlantic shore. By 670 CE, Muslims ruled Tunisia, or Africa, which the Romans had called Africa. The Arabs originally used this word as the name for eastern North Africa and Maghreb for lands to the west. By 711, Arabs and Berber armies had crossed into Spain. Only their defeat in France by Charles Martel at Poitiers in 732 brought the Muslim advance in the west to a halt. The message of Islam found fertile ground among the populations of North Africa. Conversion took place rapidly within a certain political unity provided by the Abbasid dynasty. This unity eventually broke down, and North Africa divided into several separate states and competing groups. In opposition to the states dominated by the Arabic rulers, the peoples of the desert, the Berbers, formed states of their own at places such as Fez in Morocco and at Sijilmasa, the old city of the trans-Saharan caravan trade. By the 11th century, under pressure from the new Muslim invaders, a great puritanical formist movement, whose followers called the Almoravids, grew among the desert Berbers of the Western Sahara. Launched on the course of jihad, a holy war waged to purify, spread, or protect the faith. The Almoravids moved south against the African kingdoms of the Savannah and west into Spain. In 1130, another reformist group, the Almohades, followed the same pattern. These North African and Spanish developments were an essential background to the penetration of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. Islam offered many attractions within Africa. Its fundamental teaching that all Muslims are equal within the community of believers made the acceptance of conquerors and new rulers easier. The Islamic tradition of uniting the powers of the state and religion in the person of the ruler or caliph appealed to some African kings as a way of reinforcing their authority. The concept that all members of the Ummah, or community of believers, were equal put the newly converted Berbers and later Africans on an equal footing with the Arabs, at least in law. Despite these egalitarian and somewhat utopian ideas within Islam, practices differed considerably at local levels. Social stratification remained important in Islamicized societies, and ethnic distinctions also divided the believers. Despite certain teachings on the equality between men and women, the fine for killing a man was twice that for killing a woman. The disparity between law and practice, between equality before God and inequality within the world, sometimes led to utopian reform movements. Groups such as the Almohades are characteristic within Islamic history, often developing in peripheral areas and dedicated to purifying society by returning to the original teachings of Muhammad. The Christian kingdoms, Nubia and Ethiopia. Islam was the first universalistic religion to take root in Africa, and the wave of Arab conquest across northern Africa had left behind its islands to Christianity. Christian converts could have been made in Egypt and Ethiopia even before the conversion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE. In addition to the Christian kingdom of Aksum, Christian communities thrived in Egypt and Nubia farther up the Nile. The Christians of Egypt, the Copts, spelled Copts, developed a rich tradition in contact with Byzantium, translating the Gospels and other religious literature from Greek to Coptic, their own tongue, which was based on the language of ancient Egypt. Only doctrinal and political issues, they eventually split from the Byzantine connection. When Egypt was conquered by Arab armies and then converted to Islam, the Copts were able to maintain their faith. Muslim rulers recognized them as followers of a revealed religion and thus entitled to a certain tolerance. The Coptic influence had already spread up the Nile into Nubia, the ancient land of Kush. Muslim attempts to penetrate Nubia were met with such stiff resistance in the 9th century that Christian descendants of an ancient Kush were left as independent Christian kingdoms until the 13th century. The Ethiopian kingdom that grew from Aksum was perhaps the most important African Christian outpost. Cut off from Christian Byzantium by the Muslim conquest of Egypt and the Red Sea coast, surrounded by pagan neighbors, and probably influenced by pagan and Jewish immigrants from Yemen, the Christian kingdom turned inward. Its people occupied the Ethiopian highlands, living in fortified towns and supporting themselves with agriculture on terraced hillsides. Eventually, through a process of warfare, conversion, and compromise with non-Christian neighbors, a new dynasty emerged, which under King Lalibela d. 1221 sponsored a remarkable building project in which 11 great churches were sculpted from the rock in the town that bore its name. Figure 8.2. In the 13th and 14th centuries, an Ethiopian Christian state emerged under a dynasty that traced its origin back to the biblical marriage of Solomon and Sheba. Using the Ge'ez language of Aksum as religious language and Amharic as the common speech, this state maintained its brand of Christianity in isolation while facing constant pressure from its increasingly Muslim neighbors. The struggle between the Christian state in the Ethiopian highlands and the Muslim peoples in Somalia and on the Red Sea coast shaped much of the history of the region and continues to do so today. When one of these Muslim states, which with help from the Ottoman Turks, threatened the Ethiopian kingdom, a Portuguese expedition arrived in 1542 at Massawa on the Red Sea and turned the tide in favor of its Christian allies. Portuguese attempts thereafter to bring Ethiopian Christianity into the Roman Catholic Church failed, and Ethiopia remained isolated, Christian, and fiercely independent. Kingdoms of the Grasslands. As the Islamic wave spread across North Africa, it sent ripples across the Sahara, not in the form of invading armies, but at first in the merchants and travelers who trod the dusty and ancient caravan routes toward the savannah. Africa had three important coasts of contact: the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the savannah on the southern rim of the Sahara. On the edge of the desert, where several resource zones came together, African states such as Ghana had already formed by the 8th century by exchanging gold from the forests of West Africa Ghana had already formed by the 8th century by exchanging gold from the forests of West Africa for salt or dates from the Sahara or for goods from Mediterranean North Africa. Camels, which had been introduced from Asia to the Sahara between the 1st and 5th century CE, had improved the possibilities of trade, but these animals, which had thrived in arid and semi-arid environments, could not live in the humid forest zones because of disease. Thus, the Sahel, the extensive grassland belt at the edge of the Sahara, became a point of exchange between the forest to the south and North Africa, an active border where ideas, trade, and people from the Sahara and beyond arrived in increasing numbers. Along the Sahel, several African states developed between the trading cities, taking advantage of their position as intermediaries in the trade, but their location on the open plains of the dry Sahel also meant that these states were subject to attack in periodic droughts. Founded probably in the 3rd century CE, Ghana rose to power by taxing the salt and gold exchange within its borders. By the 10th century, its rulers had converted to Islam, and Ghana was at the height of its power. At a time when William the Conqueror could muster perhaps 5,000 troops for his invasion in England, Muslim accounts reported that the Kingdom of Ghana could field an army many times that size. Eventually, however, Almoravid armies invaded Ghana from North Africa in 1076. The kingdom survived, but its power declined. By the beginning of the 13th century, new states had risen in the savannah to take Ghana's place of leadership. Sudanic states. There were several Sudanic kingdoms, and even during the height of Ghana's power, neighboring and competing states persisted, such as Takrur, spelled Takrur, on the Senegal River to the west, and Gao on the Niger River to the east. Before we deal with the most important kingdoms that followed Ghana, it is useful to review some of the elements that states had in common. The Sudanic states often had a patriarch or council of elders of a patriarchal family or group of lineages as leaders. Usually these states had a territorial core area in which the people were of the same linguistic or ethnic background, but their state extended over subordinate communities. These were conquest states, which drew on the taxes, tribute, and military support of the subordinate areas, lineages, and villages. The effective control of subordinated societies and the legal or informal control of their sovereignty are the usual definition of empires. The Sudanic states of Ghana, Mali, and Songhay fit that definition, map 8.1. The rulers of these states were considered sacred and were surrounded by rituals that separated them from their subjects. With the conversion of the rulers of Ghana and Takrur after the 10th century, Islam was used to reinforce indigenous ideas of kingship, so that Islam became something of a royal cult. Much of the population never converted, and the Islamicized ruling families also drew on their traditional powers to fortify their rule. Several savanna states rose among the various peoples in the Sudan. We can trace the development and culture of two of the most important, Mali and Songhay, as examples of the fusion of Islamic and indigenous African cultures within the context of trade and military expansion. The Empire of Mali and Sudanata, the Lion Prince. The Empire of Mali, centered between the Senegal and Niger rivers, was the creation of the Malinke peoples, who in the 13th century broke away from the control of Ghana, which was by then in decline. In Mali, the old forms of kingship were reinforced by Islam. As in many of the Sudanic states, the rulers supported Islam by building mosques, attending public prayers, and supporting preachers. In return, sermons to the faithful emphasized obedience and support of the king. Mali became a model of these Islamicized Sudanic kingdoms. The economic basis of society in the Mali Empire was agriculture. This was combined with an active tradition of trade in many products. Although, like Ghana, Mali also depended on its access to gold-producing areas to the south. Malinke merchants, or Jula, formed a small partnership in groups to carry out trade throughout the area. They spread beyond the borders of the empire and throughout much of West Africa. The beginning of Malinke expansion is attributed to Sundiata, sometimes written Sunjata, a brilliant leader whose exploits were celebrated in a great oral tradition. The griots, professional oral historians who also served as keepers of traditions and advisors to kings, began their epic histories of Mali with Sundiata, the Lion Prince. Listen then, sons of Mali, children of the black people, listen to my word. For I am telling you of Sundiata, the father of the bright country, of the savannah land, the ancestor of those who draw the bow, the master of 100 vanquished kings. He was great among kings. He was peerless among men. He was beloved of God because he was the last of the great conquerors. After a difficult childhood, Sundiata emerged from a period of interfamily and regional fighting to create a unified state. Oral histories ascribe to him the creation of the basic rules and relations of Malinke society and the outline of the government of the Empire of Mali. He became the Mansa, or emperor. It is said that Sundiata divided up the world, which meant that he was considered the originator of social arrangements. 16 clans of free people were entitled to bear arms and carry the bow and quiver of arrows as symbols of their status. 5 clans were devoted to religious duties, and 4 clans were specialists such as blacksmiths and griots. Such clan arrangements were traditional among the peoples of the savannah and had existed in ancient Ghana, but now Sundiata had credited with their origins. Although he created the political institutions of rule that allowed for his great regional and ethnic differences in the federated provinces, he also stationed garrisons to maintain loyalty and security. Travel was secure, and crime was severely punished, as Ibn Battuta, the Arab traveler, reported. Of all peoples, he said, the blacks are those who most hate injustice, and their emperor pardons none who is guilty of it. The security of travelers and their goods is an essential element in a state where commerce played so important a role. Sundiata died about 1260, but his successor expanded the borders of Mali until it controlled most of the Niger Valley, almost to the Atlantic coast. A sumptuous court was established and hosted a large number of traders. Mali grew wealthy from the trade. Perhaps the most famous of Sundiata's successors was Mansa Khan Musa, 1312 to 1337, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 brought the attention of the Muslim world to Mali. As he described in the beginning of this chapter, Mansa Musa's trip had other consequences as well. From Mecca, he brought black poet and architect Ishaq al-Salihi, Sahili, Ishaq al-Sahili, who came out from Muslim Spain. The architect directed the building of several important mosques, and eventually a distinctive form of Sudanic architecture developed that made use of the beaten clay. This can still be seen in the Great Mosque of Jinn, figure 8.3. Mali's contact with the outer world brought change and innovation. City dwellers and villagers. The cities of the Western Sudan began to resemble those of North Africa, but with a distinctive local architectural style. The towns were commercial and often included craft specialists and a resident foreign merchant community. The military expansion of states such as Ghana, Mali, and later Songhay contributed to their commercial success because of the power of protected traders. A cosmopolitan court life developed as merchants and scholars were attracted by the power and protection of Mali. Mandinka traders ranged across the Sudan and exploited their position as intermediaries. Cities of commercial exchange flourished, such as Jinn and Timbuktu, which lay just off the floodplain on the Great Bend of the Niger River. Timbuktu was reported to have a population of 50,000, and by the 14th century, its great Sanakor Mosque contained a library and associated universities with scholars, jurists, and Muslim theologians studied. The book was the symbol of civilization in the Islamic world, and it was said that the book trade in Timbuktu was the most lucrative business. For most people in the Empire of Mali and other Sudanic states, life was not centered on the royal court, the great mosque, or long-distance trade, but rather on the agricultural cycle and the village. Making a living from the land was the preoccupation of most people, and about 80% of villagers lived by farming. This was a difficult life. The soils of the savannah were sandy and shallow. Plows were rarely used. The villagers were people of the hoe who looked to the skies in the spring for the first rains to start their planting. Rice in the valleys, millet, sorghums, some wheat, fruits, and vegetables provide the basis of daily life in the village and supplied the caravan trade. Even a large farm rarely exceeded 10 acres, and most were much smaller. Clearing land often was done communally, accompanied by feast and competition, but the farms belonged to families and they worked by them. A man with 2 wives and several unmarried sons could work more land than a man with 1 wife and a smaller family. Polygamy, the practice of having multiple wives, was common in the region, and it remains so today. Given the difficulties of the soil, the periodic droughts, insect pests, storage problems, and the limitations of technology, the farmers of the Sudanic states, by the methods of careful cultivation, crop rotation, and places such as Timbuktu, the use of irrigation, were able to provide for their people the basic foods that supported them and the imperial states on which they were based. The hoe and the bow became symbols of the common people of the Savannah states. The Songhay Kingdom. As the power of Mali began to wane, a successor state from within the old empire was already beginning to emerge. The people of Songhay. It's actually pronounced Songhi, so I'm going to say it like that from now on. The people of Songhi dominated the middle areas of the Niger Valley. Traditionally, the society of Songhi was made up of masters of the soil, that is, farmers, herders, and masters of the waters, or fishers. Songhi had begun to form in the 7th century as an independent kingdom, perhaps under a Berber dynasty. By 1010, a capital was established at Gao on the Niger River, and the rulers had become Muslims, although the majority of the population remained pagan. Dominated by Mali for a while, but by the 1370s, Songhay had established an independence again and began to thrive as new sources of gold from the West African forests began to pass through its territory. Gao became a large city with a resident foreign merchant community and several mosques. Under a dynamic leader, Sunni Ali, 1464 to 1492, the empire of Songhi was forged. Sunni Ali was a great tactical commander and a ruthless leader. His cavalry expanded the borders and seized the traditional trading cities of Timbuktu and Jean. The middle Niger Valley fell under his control, and he developed a system of provincial administration to mobilize recruits for the army and rule their far-flung conquests. Although apparently a Muslim, he met any challenge to his authority even when it came from the Muslim scholars of Timbuktu, whom he persecuted. A line of Muslim rulers who took the military title Askia succeeded him. These rulers, especially Muhammad the Great, extended the boundaries of the empire so that in the mid-16th century, Songhi dominated the central Sudan. Life in the Songhi Empire followed many of the patterns established in the previous Savannah states. The fusion of Islamic and pagan populations and traditions continued. Muslim clerics and jurists sometimes were upset by the pagan beliefs and practices that continued among the population, and even more by the political interpretation of Islamic law. They wanted to impose a strict interpretation of the law of Islam, and were shocked that men and women mixed freely in the markets and streets, that women went unveiled. Songhi remained the dominant power in the region until the end of the 16th century, in 1591. A Muslim army from Morocco, equipped with muskets, across the Sahara and defeated the vastly larger forces of Songhi. This sign of weakness simulated internal revolts against the ruling family, and eventually the parts of the old empire broke away. The demise of the Songhi imperial structure did not mean the end of the political and cultural tradition of the Western Sudan. Other states that combined Muslim and pagan traditions rose among the Hausa peoples of northern Nigeria. Based on cities such as Kano and Katsina, the earliest Muslim ruler of Kano took control in the late 14th century and turned the city into a center of Muslim learning. In Kano and other Hausa cities of the region, an urbanized royal court and fortified capital ruled over the animistic villages, where the majority of the population lived. With powerful cavalry forces, these states extended their rule and protected their active trade in salt, grains, and cloth. Although these later Islamicized African states tended to be small and set their goals were local, they reproduced many of the social, political, and religious forms of the great empires of the grasslands. Beyond the Sudan, Muslim penetration came in various forms. Merchants became established in most of the major trading cities, and religious communities developed in each of these, often associated with particular families. Networks of trade and contacts established widely over the region as merchants and groups of pastoralists established their outposts in the area of Guinea, spelled Guinea. Muslim traders, herders, warriors, and religious leaders became important minorities in these segmented African societies composed of elite farmer families, occupational groups, free people, and slaves. Intermarriage often took place, but Muslim influence varied widely from region to region. Nevertheless, families of traders and lineages that became known as specialists in Muslim law spread widely through the region, so that by the 18th century, Muslim minorities were scattered widely throughout West Africa, even in areas where no Islamicized state had emerged. Political and social life in the Sudanic states. We can generalize from these brief descriptions of Mali and Songhi about the nature of the Sudanic states. The village communities, clans, and various ethnic groups continued to organize many aspects of life in the savannah. The development of unified states provided an overarching structure that allowed the various groups and communities to coexist. The large states usually represented the political aims and the power of a particular group and often of a dominant family. Many states point to the immigrant origins of the ruling families, and in reality, the movement and fusion of population were constant features in the Sudan. Islam provided a universalistic faith that served the interests of many groups. Common religion and law provided solidarity and trust to the merchants who lived in the cities and whose caravans brought goods to and from the savannah. The ruling families used Islamic titles such as Emir or Caliph to reinforce their authority, and they surrounded themselves with literate Muslim advisors and scribes who aided in government administration. The Muslim concept of a ruler who united civil and religious authority reinforced the traditional ideas of kingship. It is also important to note that in Africa, as elsewhere in the world, the formation of states heightened social differences and made these social societies more hierarchical. In all of the Sudanic states, Islam was fused with existing traditions and beliefs. Rulership and authority were still based on the ability to intercede with local spirits, and although Sudiata and Sunni Ali were normally Muslim, they did not ignore the traditional basis for their rule. For this reason, Islam in these early stages in the Sudan tended to accommodate pagan practice and belief. Large proportions of the populations of Mali and Songhi never converted to Islam, and those who did convert often maintained more of the old beliefs as well. We can see this fusion of traditions clearly in the position of women. Several Sudanic societies were matrilineal, and some recognized the role of women within lines of kinship, contrary to the normal patriarchal customs inscribed in the Sharia, or Islamic law. As in the case of Songhi, North African visitors to the Sudan were shocked by the easy familiarity between men and women, and the freedom enjoyed by women. Finally, slavery and the slave trade began between Black Africa and the rest of the Islamic world had a major impact on women and children in these societies. Various forms of slavery and dependent labor had existed in Africa before Islam was introduced. Although we know little about slavery in Central Africa in this period, slavery had a marginal aspect of the Sudanic states. Africans had been enslaved by others before, and Nubian African slaves had been known in the classical world. But with the Muslim conquest of North Africa and commercial penetration to the south, slavery became a more widely diffused phenomenon, and a slave trade in Africans developed on a new scale. In theory, Muslims viewed slavery as a stage in the process of conversion, a way of preparing pagans to become Muslims. In reality, conversion did not guarantee freedom. Slaves in the Islamic world were used in a variety of occupations, as domestic servants and laborers, but were also used as soldiers and administrators who have no local ties and affiliations, were considered to be dependent on and thus trustworthy by their masters. Slaves were also used as eunuchs and concubines, hence the emphasis on enslaving women and children. The trade caravans from the Sahel across the Sahara often transported slaves as well as gold, and as we shall see, other slave trade routes developed from the African interior to the East African coast. Frequently, the children of slave mothers were freed and integrated into Muslim society. Although this custom was positive in one sense, it also meant that a constant demand for more slaves to replace those freed. Estimates of the volume of the trans-Saharan slave trade varied widely. One scholar places the total at 4.8 million, with another 2.4 million sent to the Muslim ports on the Indian Ocean coast. Actual figures may have been considerably lower, but the trade extended over 700 years and affected a large area. It was one more way in which Islamic civilization changed Sub-Saharan Africa. The Swahili coast of East Africa. While the kingdoms of West Africa came under the influence of Islam from across the Sahara, another center of Islamic civilization was developing in the seaboard and offshore islands of Africa's Indian Ocean coast, map 8.2. Along the coast, extending south from the Horn of Africa to the Indian Ocean, to the modern-day Mozambique, a string of Islamicized trading cities developed that reflected their cosmopolitan contacts with trading partners from Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Islam provided the residents of these towns a universal set of ethics and beliefs that made their maritime contacts easier. But in East Africa, as in the savannah kingdoms of West Africa, Islamization was slow to reach the general population. When it did, the result often was a compromise between indigenous ways and the new faith. The coastal trading ports. As a first-century Greek account of the Indian Ocean, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentioned some ports in East Africa, but was vague about whether the inhabitants were Africans or immigrants from the Arabian Peninsula. From that century to the 10th century, the wave of Bantu migration had clearly reached the East African interior. Bantu-speaking herders in the north and farmers in the south mixed with older populations in the region. Other peoples were also moving to the African coast. Contact across the Indian Ocean dated back to at least the 2nd century BCE. From Indonesia or Malaya, seaborne immigrants settled on the large islands of Madagascar, and from there introduced foods such as bananas and coconuts to the Indian coast. These were widely adopted and spread rapidly along the coast and into Central Africa. Small coastal villages of fishers and farmers make rough pottery and working iron dotted this coast. By the 8th and 9th centuries, visitors and refugees from Oman and the Persian Gulf had established themselves at some of these villages, attracted by the possibilities of trade with the land of Zenj, an Arabic term for the East African coast. By the 13th century, a string of urbanized East African trading ports had developed along the coast. These towns shared the common Bantu-based and Arabic-influenced Swahili, which means coastal language, and other cultural traits. Although they were governed by separate Muslim ruling families, such as Mogadishu, Mombasa, Malindi, Kilwa, Pate, and Zanzibar, eventually contained mosques, tombs, and palaces of cut stone and coral. Ivory, gold, iron, slaves, and exotic animals were exported from these ports in exchange for silk from Persia and porcelain from China from the ruling Muslim families. The Arab traveler Ibn Battuta was impressed with the beauty and refinement of these towns. He described Kalwa as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed towns in the world, and was also impressed by the pomp and luxury of its ruler. Kilwa's advantage was its access to the gold coming from the interior and the fact that it was the farthest point south from which the ships sailing from India could hope to return in a single monsoon season. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, Kilwa flourished in the context of international trade, but it was not alone. About 30 of these port towns eventually dotted the coast. They were tied to each other by an active coastal commerce, and in a few places to the interior by a caravan trade. Although it was usually Africans who brought the goods to the coast, some Chinese ports sent goods directly to Africa in the 13th century, and as late as 1417 and 1431. Large state-sponsored expeditions sailing directly from China stopped at the East African coast to load ivory, gold, and rare woods. The Chinese discontinued such contact after 1431, and goods from China came to the coast thereafter in the ships of Arab or Indian traders. The mixture of cultures on the Swahili coast. The Islamic influence in these towns promoted long-distance commerce. The 13th century was a period of great Islamic expansion, and that faith spread eastward to India and Indonesia. It provided a religious bond of trust and law that facilitated trade throughout ports of the Indian Ocean. The ruling families of the East African trading ports built mosques and palaces. The mosque of Mogadishu was begun in 1231. Many of these ruling families claimed to be descendants of immigrants from Shiraz in Persia, a claim intended to legitimize their position and orthodoxy. In fact, some evidence indicates that the original Muslim families had emigrated to the Somali coast and from there to other towns farther south. These institutions and forms of the Muslim world operated in these cities. Whereas the rulers and merchants tended to be Muslim, the majority of the population of East African coast, and perhaps even in the towns themselves, retained their previous beliefs and culture. African culture remained strong throughout the area. The Swahili language was essentially a Bantu language containing a large number of Arabic words. Although many of these words were not incorporated until the 16th century, the language was written in an Arabic script sometime before the 13th century. The ruling families could also converse in Arabic. Islam also penetrated very little into the interior among the hunters, pastoralists, and farmers. Even the areas of the coast near the trading towns remained largely unaffected. In the towns, the mud and thatched houses of the non-Muslim common peoples surrounded the stone and coral buildings of the Muslim elite. Islam Islamization was to some extent class-based. Still, a culture developed that fused Islamic and traditional elements. For example, family lineage was traced both through the maternal line, which controlled property, the traditional African practice, and through the paternal line, which was the Muslim custom. Swahili culture was a dynamic hybrid, and the Swahili people spread their language and culture along the coast of East Africa. By the time the Portuguese arrived at this coast, around 1500, Swahili culture was widely diffused. Kilwa was no longer the predominant city, and the focus of trade had shifted to Malindi and Mombasa by the Kenya coast, but the commerce across the Indian Ocean continued. Eventually, the Portuguese raided Kilwa and Mombasa in an attempt to take control of trade. Their outpost on Mozambique and their control of Sofala put much of the gold trade in their hands. Although the Portuguese built a major outpost at Fort Jesus in Mombasa in 1592, they were never able to control the trade in the northern Swahili coast. The East African patterns, as established by the 1500, persisted even more than those of the Sudanic kingdoms. In some areas, like the Swahili coast in Western African savanna, Islam became a dominant cultural force. In other areas, such as the forest region of West Africa, Muslims remained a minority, and in other areas, like the Central African forests, Islam hardly penetrated at all. Peoples of the forest and plains. As important as the Islamic impact was on the societies of the Savannah and East African coast, other African peoples in the continent's interior and the forests of West Africa were following their own trajectories of development. We must emphasize that African societies were diverse. By 1000 CE, most of these societies were based on varied agriculture, sometimes combined with herding, and most societies used iron and weapons. Many were still organized in small village communities. In various places, however, states had formed. Some of them began to resolve the problems of integrating large territories under a single government and ruling subject peoples. Sorry, I'm going to reread that last sentence. Some of them began to resolve the problems of integrating large territories under a single government and ruling subject peoples. Whereas Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia had developed writing and other areas borrowed the Arabic script, many sub-Saharan African societies were pre-literate and transmitted their knowledge, skills, and translations by oral methods and direct instruction. The presence or absence of writing has often been used as a measure of civilization by Western observers. But as in pre-Columbian Peru, various African societies made great strides in the arts, building, and statecraft, sometimes in the context of highly urbanized settings, without a system of writing. Artists and kings, Yoruba and Benin. In the forests of central Nigeria, terracotta objects of a realistic and highly stylized form have been discovered near the village of Nok. These objects, most of which date from about 500 BCE to 200 CE, reveal considerable artistic skill. The inhabitants of ancient Nok and its region practiced agriculture and use of iron tools. These remain something of a mystery, but it appears that their artistic traditions spread widely through the forest areas and influenced other peoples. Nevertheless, there is a long gap in the historical and archaeological record between the Nok sculptures and renewed flourishing of artistic traditions in the new region after about 1000 CE. Among the Yoruba-speaking peoples of Nigeria, at the city of Ilefa, remarkable terracotta and bronze portrait heads of past rulers were produced in the period after 1200 CE. The lifelike quality of these portraits and the skill of their execution place them among the greatest achievements of African art. Figure 8.4. The artists of the Ilefa also worked in wood and ivory. Much of the art seems to be associated with kings and the authority of kingship. Ile-Ife, like other Yoruba states, seem to have an agricultural society supported by a peasantry and dominated by a ruling family and an aristocracy. Ile-Ife was considered by many people in the region by the original cultural center, and many of them trace their own beginnings to it. Yoruba origins are obscure. Ile-Ife was seen as the holiest city of the Yoruba, their place of birth. Another legend maintained by the royal historians was that Oduduwa, a son of the king of Mecca, migrated from the east and settled in Yoruba. Modern historians have suggested that the real origins were perhaps Meroe and Nubia, or at least in the savannah south of the Sahara. In any case, the Yoruba spoke a non-Bantu language of the West African Kwa family and recognized a certain affinity between themselves and neighboring peoples, such as the Hausa, who spoke Afro-Asian languages. The Yoruba were originally in small city-states, and each controlling a radius of perhaps 50 miles. The Yoruba were highly urbanized, although many of the town inhabitants farmed in the surrounding countryside. These city-states developed under the strong authority of regional kings who were considered divine. A vast royal court that included secondary wives, musicians, magicians, and bodyguards of soldiers' slaves surrounded the king. His rule was not absolute, however. We can use the example of the Yoruba state of Oyo, spelled O-Y-O, which emerged by the 14th century. Its king, the Alafin, controlled subject peoples through princes in the provinces drawn from local lineages who were allowed to exercise traditional rule as long as they continued to pay tribute to the Oyo. In the capital, a council of state, made up of nobles from the 7 city districts, advised the ruler and limited his power. And the Ogbani, or secret society of religious and political leaders, reviewed decisions of the king and the council. The union of civil and supernatural powers in the person of the ruler was the basis of power. The highly urbanized nature of Yoruba society and the flourishing of artisan traditions within these towns bear some similarity to those of the city-states of medieval Italy or Germany. Patterns similar to those in the Yoruba city-states could be found among Edo peoples to the east of Yoruba. A large city-state called Benin was formed sometime in the 14th century. Under Iwuare the Great, 1440 to 1473, Benin's control extended from the Niger River to the coast near modern Lagos. Benin City was described by early European visitors in the 16th century as a city of great population and broad avenues. The Yoruba, or ruler, lived in a large royal compound surrounded by a great entourage, and its authority was buttressed by ritual and ceremony. That authority was also the theme of the magnificent artistic output in ivory and cast bronze that became characteristic of Benin. Tradition had it that Iguaga, an artist in bronze casting, was sent from Ile-Ife. Sorry, how was that pronounced again? Ile-Ife. Bronze casting was sent from Ile-Ife. Bronze casting was sent from Ile-Ife to introduce the techniques of making bronze sculptures. Benin then developed its own distinctive style, less naturalistic than that of Ile-Ife, but no less impressive. Celebration of the powers and majesty of the royal lineages, as well as objects for the rituals surrounding kingship were the subjects of much of this art. When the first Europeans, the Portuguese, settled in Benin in the 1480s, they were impressed by the power of the ruler and the extent of his territory. Similarly, the artists of Benin were impressed with the Portuguese, and Benin bronzes and ivories began to include representations of Portuguese soldiers and other themes that reflected the contact with outsiders. Figure 8.5. Central African kingdoms. South of the rainforest that stretched across Africa almost to Lake Victoria lay a broad expanse of savanna and plain, cut by several large rivers such as the Kwango and Zambezi. From their original home in Nigeria, the Bantu peoples had spread into the southern reaches of the rainforest along the Congo River, then southward onto the southern savannas, and eventually to the east coast. By the 5th century CE, Bantu farmers and fishers had reached beyond the Zambezi, and by the 13th century they were approaching the southern end of the continent. Mostly beyond the influence of Islam, many of the Central African peoples had begun their own process of state formation by 1000 CE, replacing the pattern of kinship-based societies with forms of political authority based on kingship. Whether the idea of kingship developed in one place and was diffused elsewhere, or had multiple origins, is unknown. But the older system based on seniority with the kingship group was replaced with a rule based on the control of territory and the parallel development of rituals that reinforced the ruler's power. Several important kingdoms developed. In Katanga, the Luba peoples modified the older system of village headmen to form a divine kingship in which the ruler and his relatives were thought to have a special power that ensured fertility of people and crops. Thus, only the royal lineage was fit to rule. A sort of bureaucracy grew to administer the state, but it was hereditary, so that brothers or male children succeeded to the position. In a way, this system was a half-step toward more modern concepts of bureaucracy, but it provided a way to integrate large numbers of people in a large political unit. The kingdoms of Kondo and Moine Mutapa. The kingdoms of Congo and Moine Mutapa. Beginning around the 13th century, another kingdom was forming on the lower Congo River. By the late century, this kingdom, Congo, was flourishing. On a firm agricultural base, its people also developed the skills of weaving, pottery, blacksmithing, and carving. Individual artisans skilled in the working of wood, copper, and iron were highly esteemed. There was a sharp division of labor between men and women. Men took responsibility for clearing the forest and scrub, producing palm oil and palm wine, building houses, hunting, and long-distance trade. Women took charge of cultivation in all its aspects, the care of domestic animals, and household duties. On the seacoast, the women made salt from seawater, and they also collected the seashells that served as currency in the Congo Kingdom. The population was distributed in small family-based villages and in towns. The area around the capital, Mbaza, Congo, had a population of 60,000 to 100,000 by the early 16th century. The kingship of the Congo was hereditary, but local chieftainships were not. And this gave the central authority power to control subordinates. In a way, the Congo Kingdom was a confederation of smaller states brought under the control of the main Congo or king. By the 15th century, it was divided into 8 major provinces. The word Mani means blacksmith, and it demonstrated the importance of iron and the art of working in its association with political and ritual power. Farther to the east, another large Bantu confederation developed among the farming and cattle-herding Shona-speaking peoples in the region beyond Zambezi and Limpopo rivers. Beginning in the 9th century CE, migrants from the west began to to build royal courts in stone, to which later immigrants added more polished constructions. There were many of these Zimbabwe or stone house sites, about 200 have been found, that housed local rulers and sub-chiefs. But the largest site, called Great Zimbabwe, was truly impressive, figure 8.6. It was the center of the link between the world and the spirits. The symbol of the bird of God is found at the ruins of great modern nation of Zimbabwe, including several structures, some with strong stone walls 15 feet thick and 30 feet high. A large conical tower and extensive cut stone architecture made without the use of mortar to join the bricks together. Let me reread that sentence, actually. Great Zimbabwe, not to be confused with modern nation of Zimbabwe, included several structures, some with strong stone walls 15 feet thick and 30 feet high, a large conical tower and extensive cut architecture made without use of mortar to join the bricks together. Observers in the 19th century suspected that Phoenicians or Arabs had built these structures, mostly because their prejudices prevented them from believing that Africans were capable of erecting such buildings. But archaeologists have established that a Bantu kingdom had begun construction in stone by the 11th century CE, and had done its most sophisticated building in the 14th and 15th centuries. By the 15th century, a centralized state ruled from Great Zimbabwe had begun to form. It controlled a large portion of the interior of Southeast Africa all the way to the Indian Ocean. Under a king who took the title Mwene Mutapa, which the Portuguese later pronounced Mano Motapa. This kingdom experienced a short period of rapid expansion in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Its dominance over the sources of gold in the interior eventually gave it great advantages in commerce, which it developed with the Arab port of Sofala on the coast. Evidence of this trade is found in the glass beads and porcelain unearthed by the archaeologists at Great Zimbabwe. By the 16th century, internal divisions and the rebellion had split the kingdom apart, and perhaps an emphasis on cattle as symbol of wealth led to soil exhaustion. Control of the gold fields still provided a source of power and trade. Representations of the Mwene Mutapa called at the East Coast ports to buy Indian textiles, and their regal bearing and fine iron weapons impressed the first Europeans who saw them. As late as the 19th century, a much smaller kingdom of Mwene Mutapa survived in the interior and provided some leadership against European encroachment. But pastoralism had come to play a central role in the lives of the Shona people who descended from the great tradition. Global connections, internal development, and global contacts. This chapter has concentrated on the Sudanic states and the Swahili coast, where the impact of Islam was the most profound and where, because of the existence of written sources, it is somewhat easier to reconstruct the region's history. Sub-Saharan Africa had never been totally isolated from the Mediterranean world or other outside contacts, but the spread of Islam obviously brought large areas of Africa into more intensive contact with the global community. Even though Africa remains something of an Islamic frontier, still the infusion of Islamic and indigenous African cultures created a synthesis that reconstructed the life of many Africans. Sudanic kingdoms and the Swahili coast participated in extensive borrowing and interactions with North Africa and the Middle East, similar to imitation efforts by several other societies in the post-classical period. Islamic contacts were also heavily involved in the growing integration of several parts of sub-Saharan Africa with global trade. Although the arrival of Islam in Africa in the period from 800 to 1500 was clearly a major event, it would be wrong to see Africa's history in this period exclusively in terms of the Islamic impact. Great Zimbabwe and the Congo's Kingdom, to cite only two examples, represented the development of Bantu concepts of kingship and state building independently of trends taking place elsewhere on the continent. Similar processes and accomplishments could also be seen in Benin and among the Yoruba of West Africa. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, East Africa, and Eastern Sudan, the impact of Christianity in pre-Islamic Mediterranean world had been long felt. The dynamic relationship between the impact of these civilizations and the peoples external to Africa and the processes of development within the continent itself was a major theme in Africa's history. By the late 15th century, when the first Europeans, the Portuguese, began to arrive on the west and east coasts of Africa, in many places they found well-developed, powerful kingdoms that were able to deal with the Portuguese as equals. This was even truer in the parts of Africa that come under the influence of Islam, and through it had established links with other areas of Muslim civilization. In this period, Africa had increasingly become part of the general cultural trends of the wider world. Moreover, the intensified export trade in ivory, slaves, and especially gold from Africa drew Africans, even those far from the centers of trade, into a widening network of global relations. With the arrival of Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa in the late 15th century, the pace and intensity of the cultural and commercial contacts became even greater, and many African societies faced new and profound challenges. That's it for Chapter 8. I'm not going to read the further readings or on the web because it's not part of the main text. And we're done.